Hello everybody, wonderful weather today. So I'm here because I wanted to make a discussion video about the Henry Ford series. Just a video talking about some of the notes I wrote down but didn't have time to put in the episode, and also in the future when people start leaving comments, I will talk about comments that bring up interesting points about the subject material. So I'm going to start off by talking about my sources, one by one. Huge pile of books. So first off, a note about the web sources. In the video description, you can find archive links for all the web sources I used. I put the web source only on the episode that I used it, so just go through the episodes, and for each video, I put the sources that I used for that video. So the archive link, if you don't know what that is, it's a pretty neat tool. It lets me save a copy of the web page from the date that I accessed it. So if you click that link, you see what the web page looked like when I was using it for my sources. And then at the top, there's going to be a link. You can copy-paste that link and see what the web page looks like now. Now, onto the books. I'm talking about this book first because I wanted to give a lesson on historical bias. The book is The Legend of Henry Ford by Keith Sward. I used this book. This book was published in 1948. I used it because some of the other sources I was using were published during Ford's life. So the main parts that I used this for was the last decade of Ford's life. And reading it, I was tempted to put it down and just pick a different book because of such strong bias in this. But it had so much information, it went so far in depth into things that the other books just brushed over. It was my best source of information for the Willow Run plant and for the 1941 strike, that one. I googled Keith Sward. I couldn't find out much about him, but given this was published in 1948, and which book, I think it was one of these two books, actually called Keith Sward out by name as one of Ford's greatest critics. So, given what I know, I would bet money that this guy was somehow involved in the Union side of the 1941 strike. Just super biased, goes so far into detail, just as much research as he needs to do in order to make Ford look bad. Which, it's good facts, but it should be taken with a grain of salt, because some of this might be exaggerated. Yeah. My next book source, A Great Life in Brief, Henry Ford, written by Roger Burlingame. This one is actually part of a series of biographies of different people written by different authors, but it was pretty useful. Short, sweet, to the point. However, I did think this one had the best conclusion. Like, for example, Keith Sward just blew over the conclusion. His conclusion was Henry Ford II is in control now. Things might get better. That's essentially 3 pages of that, not even talking about Ford's life. This one, written in 1946, had half a conclusion, but because of when it was written, it didn't really have the chance to cover Ford's whole retirement, his whole death. And this one, if I recall correctly, it was 1929, if I open it from the right side. Yeah, 1929. So, this one ended halfway through Ford's life. So, this book really had the best, most summing up conclusion. I'll actually read off a quote from the author from the book. Ford was not, however, an inevitable product of his time. He was original and revolutionary. He defied precedent. He never once allowed the impossibilities of the past to limit the possibilities of the future. This, above all, was what he meant when he said that history was bunk. So that's actually not the quote I thought I had written down. I might have it saved in my phone, I'm pretty sure. Gonna look this up. I found the quote I was looking for. This is pretty awesome. Okay, you ready? Here's the quote. The tales of Ford's individual kindnesses and whimsical personal charities would fill as large a volume as those demonstrating his hardness of heart. So, that one I kept in mind pretty much the whole time. Like, if you'll notice, I tried to layer it on bad, good, because there's just so much of both. Like, one minute he's having this intense fight with the Union, smearing them in the media, doing shady things to try and win the battle. And then the next, he's providing good work opportunities for people who otherwise wouldn't have a chance. He's bailing out banks, he's saying questionable things about Jews. There's just... the good is so good, and the bad is so bad. It's hard to balance them out and pick a side. This book, for all the short that it was, it really illustrated well how both liked and disliked his legacy is, different parts of his legacy. So there's that. This next one is by William Simmons, like I said, 1946. This one was a pretty good source, nothing super outstanding to say about it, but it wasn't bad by any means. It tried its best to be non-biased, and also occasionally through here, I'm looking for one, just every 50 pages or so, there's a cool picture page, one on each side. Interior of Bagley Avenue Workshop as restored by Mr. Ford in Greenfield Village. So, it's pretty cool. And an artist's conception of the scene in the alley behind the 58 Bagley Avenue, Detroit, when the first Ford car was wheeled from the shop. So, fun picture book. It's more than a fun picture book, it's actually pretty informative. It's a good source. I like this one. Last but not least, my favorite, I'll call this one the most quirky. Although this only covered half of Ford's life, it is as thick as the Keith Sward book. Hi. Hello, puppy. Oh, Barb. I saw a dog today, that's pretty good. I'm just at the park, there's some people on a blanket, picnic blanket over there. The dog. It's a good dog. Anyway, this one written in 1929 by Charles Murs. I call it quirky because of his writing style. He just goes... he loves artfully illustrating scenes with words. Like, I heavily drew on this for all the parts of Ford's life that it covered, because I probably should have found a good passage as an example of this and planned to read it, like bookmark it, and read it to the camera, but I didn't end up doing that. But anyway, my favorite part of this was when Ford first ran his first successful car in Detroit down the street and up again. Just the scene he set. I tried to replicate it, but I couldn't do it justice. This book was pretty great, and also, I'll give credit to the time it was written at least. It touched on some cool, like, cultural things that the other books didn't touch on. For example, onto my list of notes. My list of notes, here is the Ford joke. This guy has an entire chapter on it. It's during, like, the early years of Ford's big popularity, when, like, everyone was buying his cars, people would make jokes about the Ford factory. So, I have a few of them written down here. There's one about a farmer who, a hurricane came and tore the roof off his barn, so he just had this hunk of torn up tin metal just sitting in his yard. So he's looking at this, and his neighbor comes over and tells him, you know, I hear they're always looking for metal over at the Ford plant. Here's another dog. Hey, puppy. Hi, puppy. Oh, do you see another dog? Huh? Do ya? Go see him. That first dog was 5 months old. They're like 15 feet away sniffing each other. But anyway, oh, hi. Hi. So anyway, the farmer's neighbor came over and saw, like, the torn up pile of tin roof and said, you know, the Ford plant's always looking for scrap metal. So the farmer says, okay, whatever, I'll send the metal off to the Ford plant. A week later, the farmer gets this letter with, like, the boy dog figured out the other one is a girl dog. So a week later, the farmer gets this nice letter back from Highland Park, like this nice professional-looking Highland Park letterhead. And the letter says, Mr. Smith, I gotta be honest, your car is the worst wreck we have ever seen over here, but do not worry, in a week we will send your car back, it'll run like new. So that's one. Another one, there's a shop owner that sells various things, bed springs among them. Bed springs, okay. So, this guy's driving a Ford down the road, the Ford breaks down, and the shop is the closest thing he can walk to. So he walks to the shop, goes inside, talks to the owner, hey, my car broke down, do you have any parts or anything I can use to fix it? And the shop owner says, I don't really sell car parts, but you're welcome to look around. So, the guy with the car looks around, he finds a bed spring, buys the bed spring, the shop owner watches him walk outside, opens up the hood of the Model T and, like, fiddles around in there and replaces part of the transmission with it. So the owner's like, okay, cool, that was pretty handy. And that ends up happening, like, 2 more times that week. And so after a while, the owner just gets a sign to hang out in front of his shop, and he paints it, Ford Parts and Accessories Sold Here. There's a joke about Model Ts are now being painted yellow, so they can just hang them in bunches and sell them in front of grocery stores like bananas. There's one about an old lady that collects tin cans of tomato juice. Just empty tin cans. And her neighbor tells her, hey, send those cans to the Ford factory. So she does, and a week later she gets a Ford car and 8 cans left over. I have a note written down here to let you guys know that I didn't know the Dearborn Independent was a thing until I started researching Ford. So, like, I picked Ford, I got some of the research done, and then I found out, wow, he wrote that. I had no clue. I just knew he invented the assembly line and founded the Ford company. So there's that. If I had known about that, I probably would have picked someone else as a first biography of this YouTube channel. But I didn't know that, and I picked a pretty controversial, challenging person, and I think it turned out alright. I don't know. You guys tell me how I did. Next up in my notes. Oh yeah, there's a story about Henry Ford being at a race in 1905, and during the race, one of the European cars crashed, and a bunch of parts, like, rolled away from it, and one of the parts landed at Ford's feet. So he picked it up, and he examined it later, and he found out the metal that made it is so much lighter and so much tougher than the steel that Ford was using. So he gave the part to his assistants. He said, find out what this metal is, where it came from. Found out it was called vanadium steel. Tensile strength is 170,000 up from 70,000 that Ford was using, and like I said, it was lighter. So, Ford hires a metallurgist from England and brings him over to Ohio and puts the metallurgist in charge of his Ohio steel plant. So that's how Ford gets vanadium steel in all his cars. I have a note just numbers and statistics. This was from the Blue Book, the Charles Murr's book, 1929. In 1903, there were 2 cars for every 1,000 families. In 1908, that number was 9 for every 1,000, and in 1914, it was 97. So, in 10 years, that's like 50 times the amount of cars on the road, and Ford's assembly line is credited with that. Because he started with the assembly line, and all the other companies said, hey, he's making a lot of money, he's making a lot of cars, selling cars to a lot of people, let's do that. And after a while, cars just became the norm. There was a tractor company that Henry Ford started with Edsel. It was called Fordson, Ford and Son Tractor Company. And that tractor company was officially the company that got the contract to send the tractors to England during the First World War. Ford's conflict with the NRA, with FDR at the beginning of FDR's term. I've read up multiple sources about that, and none of them mention unions as being a big deal, but knowing what I know, examining everything, I'm pretty sure that the unions played at least some part in Ford's decision to oppose that. I should mention that during World War I, Ford suddenly changing his mind and going, yeah, all out, let's win this thing. Peace through superior firepower. The rest of the country did that too, so it wasn't just Ford suddenly, drop of a hat, changing his mind. It was the entire American media, the entire American public, the majority at least. I wanted to talk about Ford, the question of whether he treated his workers well because he wanted to avoid unions, or if he just had a good heart. I think it's somewhere in the middle, honestly, mix of the two. Like, I think the good heart, I think helping people was at least a little bit going through his mind, like it was a nice perk. But I think unions, like wanting to avoid unions being able to gain leverage, played into his decision, his mindset, a little more heavily. So that's my opinion. I have a note here about the Dearborn Independent. Only one source mentioned this. I believe it might have been the neo-Nazi website, or it might have been one of the books I mentioned, one of those two. I forget which. But the source mentioned that when Ford was on the peace ship, he had a Jewish friend, and they got into a conversation about the Jewish friend telling Ford how Jews secretly control everything. And that's when Ford said, wow, I never knew about this, I want to learn more about this, and one thing led to another, and he ended up publishing a magazine about it. That's at least what that one source says, so take it with a grain of salt, but that's one thing I've heard. Oh yes, now I was very careful to mention all the different sources when talking about the Hunger March. That's because one of the places I looked when I was researching it is, I just for fun, not intending to use it as a source, I skimmed over Wikipedia. The Wikipedia page is the most biased, illogical even, anti-Ford thing, pro-union thing that I have ever seen, even more so than Sward. That's because I scrolled down to the bottom to check their sources. There's a lot of sources, don't get me wrong, but 90% of them are from one author. I looked up the author, and she was actually alive at the time, one of the people working with the communist marchers. So, if you want to know why not to use Wikipedia for a school project, there you go. You'll get things like Wikipedia telling you Bennett for no reason just opened up fire on the crowd. Please don't brigade Wikipedia unless you know what you're talking about. I didn't bother changing it because I didn't want to get into a whole passive-aggressive thing with these people, so I just left a note on the talk page with a lot of my sources that probably no one looked at. If you feel like reading some books on the topic, by all means, go ahead and start a passive-aggressive edit fest with people who are heavily anti-Ford on that page. One of the things I wanted to mention, I found pretty... Dog again. Hi. Puppy. Hi. Happy puppy. Happy puppy. I forget what I was gonna say. It was... It's at the tip of my tongue. I'll just look it again. Oh yeah, Ford was alive for over 80 years. He saw a whole lot of history. He was at the head of his industry for decades. He was the CEO of his company for over 40 years. One of my sources mentioned that during his lifetime, he saw over half of American history to that date. So, that's pretty cool. My country is super young. Anyway, this one's less fact and more discussion. I wanted to just kind of get you guys to think about, when did Ford go from treating his workers best in the industry, highest income in the industry, most benefits, to unions fighting tooth and nail? How much of what the union said is slander? When was the cutoff date that Ford lived long enough to see himself become a villain? In that regard, in labor treatment at least, working conditions at least. Another hypothetical question, could Ford have avoided the big fight with the union and still maintained a no-union factory without sacrificing production much, had he put in a good system to address worker grievances, and had he put less faith in the hardline Bennett way of things? I wrote down as a note, why did Willow Run fail so bad, and did Willow Run actually fail that bad? Because, like I said, the most in-depth source I had on Willow Run was the Keith Sward book, and Keith Sward the whole time really highlighted all the mistakes that were made, all the administrative circus acts, and Keith Sward kind of glossed over, but I found out from other books that, well, Willow Run was failing making inadequate airplanes, and making an inadequate amount of airplanes. His other factories were doing pretty awesome at turning out tanks and tank engines. Just thought question, why did Willow Run fail so bad? Worker morale, worker turnover rate, that had a lot to do with it. The administrative circus, at least before they found that one good person that stayed more permanently, that had something to do with it. Edsall's death in 1943. Edsall was really involved in Willow Run. He was a big part of what made that startup. His death really affected the ability of that factory to function. His death and the following Bennett purges. Hello, puppy. So, those are a couple of reasons. I wanted to mention, as part of my perspective, throughout most of my research, I was of the mind that the unions were a bad idea because I was unknowingly biasing myself reading sources from Ford's point of view. Also, I think the 1929 Hunger March was just so crazy that also a little bit biased me against the unions. So it got to the point when it got to 1941 and I was reading about, wow, are the unions the good guys in this? Is Ford the bad guy? What? Why? How? Yeah. After that, I just sat down and took a good long think over... That actually prompted my other note. when did Ford become the bad guy? So, yeah, reading through that, it wasn't till 1941 that I stepped back and reevaluated the role of the Union in Ford's whole life story. Burlingame's conclusion, I just love that. I read you the quotes already. Also, there's a quote from Ford. I'm not sure whether or not I'm going to end up putting this in. I'm actually filming after I published the 4th video, so I have at least 2 more videos to go. But I probably will put this in the video, but in case I don't, I'm going to read you this quote from Henry Ford about hiring people who are somehow handicapped, blind, armless. The subdivision of industry opens places that can be filled by practically anyone. There are more places in subdivision industry that can be filled by blind men than there are blind men, and in each of these places, the man who short-sightedly might be considered as an object of charity can earn just as adequate a living as the kindest and most able-bodied. It is a waste to put an able-bodied man in a job that might be just as well cared for by a cripple. It is a frightful waste to put the blind at weaving baskets. So that was Ford's feeling about hiring people, like blind people, people who lost an arm, people that other industries might just write off. Like, unemployment benefits were made with these people in mind, and then comes Ford, assembly line, looking at the whole process. That job can be done by a person with 1 arm. Why does that guy have 2 arms? Get a cripple in there. That job can be done by a blind person. Why can that guy see? Get a blind person in there. Then comes Ford. Just not even entirely for the good of human beings either. I mean, I'm sure at night he thought about satisfaction from knowing he was giving a chance to people that no one else gave a chance to. But the way his mind worked, like focusing on productivity and minimizing waste. That's a pretty interesting way to think about life, and he really revolutionized hiring practices. So I think that's pretty significant, how unsung that part of Ford's life is. I wanted to give special mention to that. Also, something I didn't really mention, this is the last quick note. This was in like the late 30s, early 40s, but Ford had a savings plan that his employees could buy into. Like, imagine like a bank savings account, but the Ford company employees only. They could pay their savings, and Ford would hold it in the company vault and give them 4.5% interest rate on that, which was, at the time, a lot higher than a lot of the bank savings plans were. So that was exclusive to Ford employees too, so that's interesting fact I didn't find a good place to shove in. So that's what I got. I hope you liked the Ford series. Leave me feedback. If you have anyone you want to see me do, suggest it below. I will add it to the list. Yeah. Let me know what you think. I love hearing feedback. Please leave comments. I know I have only a handful of subscribers so far, but please, I love seeing comments. I can't wait to start interacting with fans. Yeah.